In this talk, I want to give some background to the movie Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan, which is about to come out in just a couple of days. The movie, like my talk, will be based on is based on this book, um, American Prometheus: The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. I can highly recommend this book, but it's, like it's 600-700 pages, not counting the front and back matter. If you want to have like a quicker introduction to Oppenheimer with all the essentials, I can recommend this book by Jeremy Bernstein, Portrait of an Enigma, which has the length of like a New Yorker profile. So here is the cast, the main actors in the movie. Cillian Murphy plays Robert Oppenheimer. I'll explain, the role of the other ones like as we go along. The cast, however, is really huge, and so this is plucked off from the web. And so in the talk, I'll explain to you the role of these characters. And so this is another batch of actors, and I'll explain the role of most of these characters. So what I want to do is give a talk in three parts. So I'll talk a little bit about his early years, then I'll talk about the Manhattan Project, and then I talk about like the famous or infamous 1954 security hearings where Oppenheimer got stripped of his security clearance. All right. So Oppenheimer came from a wealthy Jewish family in New York. His father was a successful businessman. His mother was interested in art and collected a bunch of very interesting paintings, including some Van Goghs. Oppenheimer is always described as a precocious youth, right? So here you see Oppenheimer, and you see his younger brother Frank, who also plays an important role in the story. The two of them attended the Ethical Culture School in New York, which had been founded by wealthy Jews in New York, because the better private schools were not admitting their kids. One of his close friends was I. Rabi, who's also in the movie. And Rabi came from a poorer and more Orthodox Jewish family in New York, and he always felt that made him more grounded in a way than Oppenheimer. And so he described Oppenheimer as a man who was put together of many bright, shining splinters who never got to be an integrated personality. And Rabi himself thought that Oppenheimer's sort of ambivalent relationship to his own Jewishness was responsible for that. I hope the movie will contain this famous line by Rabi, that while he was testifying in Robert's defense at this 1954 security hearing, where he says, look, we have an A-bomb, thanks to Oppenheimer, a whole series of it. What more do you want? Mermaids? So Oppenheimer was accepted by Harvard in 21, but he got sick, and so he didn't enroll that year. And he goes to the American Southwest to recover. Here you see him on horseback, and this is where he first encounters Los Alamos. He studied with people who several of whom went on to win Nobel Prizes. Oppenheimer himself did not. Percy Bridgman at Harvard. He went to J.J. Thomson in Cambridge, got his PhD with Born in Göttingen, and every physics student knows about the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, and then did postdocs with Ehrenfest in Leiden and Pauli in Zurich. And in Leiden, he acquired the nickname in Dutch Opje, and his American friends always refer to him as Oppie. So there's a few famous anecdotes about his student years. One is that he left a poisoned apple on the desk of Patrick Blackett. Now somehow, fortunately, nothing happened to Blackett, his tutor, but the money of his family somehow made this incident go away. So Blackett is played in the movie, so I assume this anecdote will be in there. The two other ones are not. So Oppie had the bad habit, even as a student, to constantly interrupt whoever was speaking. And so fellow students got fed up with this. And one of them, the later Nobel Prize winner Maria Guppert, handed Born a petition demanding that Born put a stop to this. But Born was too intimidated by Oppenheimer himself to confront him. So what he did was he left the petition on his desk, called Oppenheimer into his office, and then left him there alone to discover this petition. Right? So apparently his behavior then improved, at least for a while. Okay? So the third anecdote once again illustrates just how wealthy Oppenheimer was compared to his classmates. So he had a beautiful suitcase that was the envy of his fellow students. He ended up giving this to a love interest, Charlotte Riefenstahl, no relation to Leni Riefenstahl. His feelings were not reciprocated, and Charlotte ended up marrying another physicist, Fritz Houtemans, and you see him here in the picture with their daughter Giovanna, who, as I learned from a book by my physics colleague, Mr. Schiffman, ended up as a math professor at St. Olaf here in Minnesota. So upon returning to the US, Oppenheimer gets a dual appointment as professor at Caltech and Berkeley, and builds up his own school of theoretical physics at Berkeley, right? Giving a legendary class on quantum mechanics that formed the basis for a famous textbook of one of his students, Leonard Schiff. And he also worked closely with experimentalists, most importantly, Ernest Lawrence, the inventor of the cyclotron. And there's another, local connection, Josh Hartnett, who plays Lawrence in the movie. It was actually a graduate of Minneapolis South High School, just like my son. Lawrence also has a Minnesota connection. He started his undergraduate career at St. Olaf, but sadly transferred to another school in his sophomore year. So during the 30s and during the Great Depression, Oppenheimer becomes conscious of his privilege and the lack thereof among his students, and then becomes interested in politics. And so his girlfriend at the time, Jean Tadlock, was a member of the Communist Party. So his political interests are very much to the left. This relationship was broken off in 1939. She tragically committed suicide in 1944. But Oppie and Jean Tadlock stayed in touch. Oppie then met his wife, Kitty, also with strong communist ties. Both these women play an important, a very important role in the movie, right? They're among the main cast members. Oppie and Kitty have 2 kids, Peter and Tony, as she was known, who sadly later also ended up a suicide. All right, I move on to the Manhattan Project. And first, some background about the discovery of nuclear fission. This is a story that my predecessor at the University of Minnesota, Roger Stewart, worked on in great detail. So here's a very short version. So in 1931, this guy, James Chadwick, discovered the neutron. But Chadwick thought that the neutron was like a compound of an electron and a proton. And it took further experiments by Irene Curie, the daughter of Marie Curie, and her husband, Frédéric Joliot, to show, no, this is really a new elementary particle. And so, once you have the neutron, the people realize this is a great tool to probe the nucleus of different elements. If you use protons or alpha particles, which are helium nuclei, they will be repelled by the target nucleus because both are positively charged. But neutrons slam into the target nucleus without any such repulsion and should therefore do more damage, right? And so Fermi and his group in Rome bombard all these different elements with neutrons to see what happens. Fermi is also in this movie, but mostly because of his role on the Manhattan Project later on. In Berlin, there's another group doing this, Otto Hahn and Lisa Meitner. And you see, I noted that, to 1938, then, the political developments catch up with these groups. So Fermi leaves Italy to pick up his Nobel Prize in Sweden, doesn't go back to Italy, but instead goes to Sweden. Now, Meitner, who's an Austrian Jew, she could still work in Germany in 1933 because she was Austrian, but then in 1938, there's the Anschluss, so now Austria is part of Germany, so she has to be spirited out of Germany, first to the Netherlands, and ends up in Sweden. But Hahn keeps her abreast of developments in the lab in Berlin. And in December, he writes to Meitner that if you bombard uranium with neutrons, you get barium. And that is very puzzling. Barium is like, so halfway the periodic table. The prevailing view is that, like what happens, these neutrons chip off alpha particles when they hit the heavy nuclei, and you have to chip off quite a few alpha particles to get all the way from uranium to barium. Yet Hahn found no trace of helium. So, puzzle. So on Christmas Eve, 1938, Meitner meets her nephew, Otto Frisch, another refugee from Austria, for breakfast, and they discuss Hahn's puzzle. And it turns out that the key to solving the puzzle is the liquid drop model of the nucleus, which was introduced by George Gamow in 1928. And as I'll explain, like on the next two slides, like what was important here is that Meitner and Frisch were up on very different aspects of research into this liquid drop model. So Meitner knew all about what was happening in Berlin, and there, like von Weizsäcker was an important, a student of Heisenberg was important here. They worked on what are called like mass defect curves, and basically there's a plot. It's a plot of the energy per nucleon against the mass number, and you see here that at the beginning of the periodic table, the energy per nucleon is very high, and towards the end of the periodic table, uranium is like the energy is also relatively high. It's low in the middle, right? So it is advantageous, right, for a nucleus energetically to move to the middle. But how does it get there, right? And so this is where the Copenhagen tradition comes in. The picture that was tacitly used before with these neutrons chipping off alpha particles turned out to be wrong. What really happens is that, and this is a drawing by Frisch illustrating this, is that the neutron infiltrates this target nucleus, wreaks havoc, and that, under certain conditions, like, this nucleus can then elongate and break, like a drop from a leaky faucet. And this then also explained like some puzzling discovery that was made by Fermi's group, namely that slow neutrons are better at doing damage to target nuclei than fast ones, right? Which, if you think about like, slamming into it and chipping things off, like makes no sense. But now, it's just these slow ones are better at infiltrating the nucleus. So this was like quite a memorable breakfast at Kungelf. And I think that should be the title for a prequel to this, to the Oppenheimer movie. And I even have like the music that should go with it.
And I said, what about breakfast at Tiffany? She said, I think I remember the film.
And so what makes this episode particularly interesting for historians of science is that it nicely illustrates a few points that we like to emphasize. So the role of politics in science. Remember, Meitner and Frisch were both refugees. The role of local traditions in science. Like, remember, there was different uses of the liquid drop model in Berlin and Copenhagen, and both these traditions were critical to figuring out the puzzle. And finally, it also illustrates the role of gender in science, because the Nobel Prize for the discovery of fission, like arguably like, one of the most important discoveries in physics in the 20th century, did not go to Meitner, but to Hahn. Admittedly for chemistry rather than physics, but still, I think this is just a grave injustice. Anyway, so how do we now get from fission to an atomic bomb? So first, let's look at the Germans. The Germans like realized this very early on, right? So a physical chemist in Hamburg alerts the head of the Army Ordnance Bureau to the possibility of an atomic bomb. That guy, Schumann, has his explosive experts, Diepner, look into this. Diepner like recruits like an expert on nuclear physics, a student of Heisenberg, Bache. And the moment that World War II starts with Hitler's invasion of Poland, these two guys, Diepner and Bache, immediately issue military orders to the big guns, Heisenberg, von Weizsäcker, Hahn, and shortly thereafter you have the first meetings of what is called the Uranium Club, the Uranverein, at the Heereswaffenamt in Berlin. So Heisenberg, the most prominent of these physicists, is in the movie, and he, of course, is played by Walter White. Not really, but this is the guy playing Heisenberg. All right. So the Americans find out about fission because, like Rosenfeld, like lets the cat out of the bag, like talking to an audience in Princeton. So on the way over from Denmark to the US, Bohr has told Roosevelt about this, but Bohr has neglected to tell Roosevelt to keep his mouth shut until like Meitner, Hahn, and Frisch have been able to publish their results. But once the cat is out of the bag, of course, like people immediately become extremely interested. So Bohr is also in the movie, like he's played by Kenneth Branagh. And just as Oppenheimer is kind of a guru to many in the American physics community, Bohr is kind of the guru to Oppenheimer. Anyways, so there's great excitement about this, right? And people quickly, put two and two together, right? So what you have is that fission, like, the breaking up of a uranium nucleus releases a huge amount of energy. Plus, it releases more neutrons that can then produce like a chain reaction. If you control that chain reaction, you have a great source of energy. If you just let it run away, you have a bomb. Okay. Now, Bohr realized in 1939 that the bomb proposition is not so easy, because for that you need like a rare isotope of uranium, not U-238, but U-235. And here's yet another Minnesota connection. It's in March of 1940 that L. Neer at the University of Minnesota is the first to succeed in separating U-235 from U-238 with a mass spectrometer. And if you enter the Tate Lab of Physics, you see like this plaque remembering that feat and other contributions made by L. Neer by mass spectrometers. All right, as I said, like, September 1st, start of the Second World War. And that's also happens to be the date that a detailed paper on the theoretical understanding of fission by Bohr and Wheeler appears in Physical Review. Now, quite sensibly, early in 1940, another, Hungarian emigre, Leo Szilard, lobbies for a publication embargo on this, right? You don't want to give the Germans this information. Szilard is a very important character, and so he is also in the movie. One of the papers that still slips through the cracks is the discovery of the first transuranic element, right? The element beyond uranium, neptunium. But the really important one, element number 94, plutonium, discovered in 1941 by Seaborg. That discovery is only published after the war. Now, the Germans, in fact, also realized this, and they also thought that like probably plutonium is what you should produce to make a bomb. All right, so the Brits or two like German refugees in Britain are the ones who are going to look into this, like on the Allied side. And so this is like Otto Frisch and Rudolf Piles. And they realized that the critical amount of U-235 is about 1 pound, the size of a tennis ball. That looks interesting enough to have a committee look into this. This is the MAUD committee. This is an acronym I won't explain. It's like a misunderstanding. It's basically like Bohr sends a letter saying like, give my regards to Maud in Kent. And Maud is just like the English tutor of Bohr's children, but the British intelligence services think this is some sort of code, and so now it becomes the Maud Committee. And so they issue their final report in the summer of 1941, and the conclusion is that yes, this is feasible, but it's too big an enterprise for Britain alone. The Maud report is immediately passed on to Moscow by Klaus Fuchs, who is working with Born, who is now in Edinburgh, and Klaus Fuchs would also end up like working on the Manhattan Project. So Klaus Fuchs is also in the movie. Now the Americans like get interested, and there's like FDR is alerted to this possibility of a bomb by a famous letter by Einstein. Right? It's basically Szilard like gets Einstein to write this letter, helps him draft it, and so in October of 1939, Einstein's letter is delivered. And I want to show you like a little clip of like a reenactment of drafting this this letter.
Fall of 1939, Dr. Albert Einstein wrote his now famous letter to President Roosevelt, explaining the urgency of work on uranium fission. Roosevelt, a man of action, moved swiftly. An advisory committee on uranium was appointed.
So this last line is my favorite. Like he moved swiftly, an advisory committee was appointed. We all know that if you want to make sure that nothing is done, you appoint like committees, right? And this is precisely what happens. In late 1940, that advisory committee becomes part of a subcommittee of a newly formed National Defense Research Committee, chaired by this guy, Vannevar Bush, also in the movie. He was kind of the first presidential science advisor. He'd been a high-level administrator at MIT, the Carnegie Institution, and he would later play an important role in the creation of the NSF in 1950, like the National Science Foundation. Now his committee like becomes part of like an even larger committee, right? And so now, you know, like you have like a report in 1941 by Ernest Lawrence, like stressing like this option of plutonium. Now, I want to say about that letter of Einstein that Einstein really resented that, you know, because of that and because of E equals mc squared, like he was seen as the father of the atomic bomb, right? And this is very much reinforced by this cover of Time magazine in '46, where you see like, you know, Einstein with the typical sort of mushroom cloud of an atomic explosion behind him. Clearly, like the more reasonable candidate for father of the atomic bomb is Oppenheimer, who was also put on the cover of Time magazine and would return on the cover of magazine like a number of years later, but now he's no longer the hero, but the villain, as we'll see. Now the U.S. gets more serious about the atomic bomb after the attack on Pearl Harbor, like, you know, like well over 2 years after this Einstein letter. And so so now, you know, like first, like the effort is concentrated at the University of Chicago with Arthur Holly Compton and Fermi, who has ended up there. And the plan is to build like a uranium reactor to produce plutonium for a bomb. And they estimate that it's going to take them 2 years for building the reactor and another 2 years for actually building the bomb. Now, so here is like the group of men, you know, like advising the administration. So you see Lawrence, Compton's brother, like a wealthy industrialist like Alfred Loomis from Tuxedo Park. But the guys in the middle really are the most important two characters, like Vannevar Bush, whom I already mentioned, and Jim Conant, the president of Harvard. These are really the movers and shakers, and like both of them are in the movie. So in December of 1942, they have like a prototype plutonium generator operational, at which point FDR approves the plan to scale up the project. Right. So this then leads in early 1943 to the establishment of the operation codenamed Manhattan Engineer District, which of course is now known as the Manhattan Project, headed by General Leslie Groves, who had overseen the building of the Pentagon in 41-42. And Groves is played by none other than Matt Damon. So there's some debate about should we go for uranium or plutonium bombs. Like Groves decide like it's best to pursue both, hoping that at least one of the two like works out. So here you see like the organizational chart for the project. Like you see that Groves like basically responds directly to the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who responds, of course, directly to the president. So I want to make it quite clear that this is like it's not just Los Alamos, right? Los Alamos is just one of various sites for this project, and the other main sites are Oak Ridge in Tennessee, where you have plans to separate U-235 from U-238, and Hanford in Washington, where you have reactors to generate plutonium. So what they did in Los Alamos there, it's basically like take that material and design the bomb. So here to give you a sense of the scale of the operation. So here's an aerial shot of this gaseous diffusion plant in Oak Ridge. Here is like, the workers coming out after a shift. You see that these are all women. Most of the men were off fighting. Women were not told what this was for. They just like were turning dials and, but did very important work in getting like U-235 for the bomb. Here's like an aerial shot of these reactors in Hanford, again, like, massive industrial production. And so, like now all that material has to be shipped to Los Alamos. Groves like picks Oppenheimer to head the lab in Los Alamos, which is a strange choice because like Oppenheimer's a theorist. He has never like organized anything, but we'll see that Oppenheimer actually turned out to be like a smart choice on Groves's part. Now, what later is going to play a very important role, namely like Oppenheimer's like left wandering in his communist sympathies, basically play no role in this at this point. Like as Oppenheimer's student Robert Serber, who's also in the movie here, you see him with Oppenheimer. As he says, if normal procedure had been applied, 3/4 of the people at Los Alamos, including very likely himself, i.e. Bob Serber, would not have been cleared. And Bernstein, in this book that I recommended, he says, my sense is that if the devil himself had turned out to have unexpected abilities in nuclear physics, Groves would have cleared him, but put him under constant surveillance. So here are some of the characters from of Los Alamos, right? So here's Hans Bethe, like expert on nuclear physics. He was appointed like the head of the theory group, played in the movie. Here's Edward Teller, very bitter that he wasn't put in charge of the theory group. He is often known as the real Dr. Strangelove. He had actually no interest in this fission bomb. Like he wanted to go immediately for a fusion bomb, the super, as he called it. And so at the end, like, since Oppenheimer had a very big budget, he just put like, let Teller work in his own corner on this super, never got anywhere with that. But at least he wasn't like, messing with the other people. And so if I could pick like one part to play in this movie, I would pick the part of Oppenheimer. Of Teller, like actually. The movie makers also couldn't resist like putting Richard Feynman in the movie. You can read about his antics in his little book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. So Jack Quaid gets to play Richard Feynman. Now, they face serious technical hurdles in Los Alamos. It turned out that it's very hard to get a U-235, but once you have it, it's very easy to detonate like a bomb. Like it's just a matter of shooting two subcritical pieces together, and then it goes kaboom. But it turned out that for a plutonium bomb, so plutonium is easier to get once you have these reactors up and running, that won't work because there is contamination of like another isotope of plutonium. What you want is plutonium-239. You have an isotope 240, which like fissions spontaneously at too high a rate, which causes the bomb to fizzle rather than to explode. And so this caused like a real crisis at Los Alamos. And the best hope was that they would compress like a sphere of plutonium that was at first like non-critical and compress it to a smaller sphere that was critical and goes kaboom. But that has to be done very, very carefully and with preserving sort of the spherical symmetry of the process. So von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, like very important for the development of computers later, he arrives at Los Alamos in the fall of 1943, and like his calculations suggest like this will work, at least in principle. But the team actually working on this, like led by Seth Nettermeyer, is making painfully slow progress. So in June of 1944, Oppenheimer decides to replace like Nettermeyer by George Kistiatowski. And like I think like these problems will be like part of the movie because like both Nettermeyer and Kistiatowski are among the people cast. So now, in addition to the technical problems, there's also moral qualms, like especially towards the end, right? Because remember, the predicate started for fear of the Germans getting there first. But by late 1944, it is clear that the Germans are losing the war, and that that they're not even close to having a bomb. So, and that becomes even clearer when there's a mission known as the Alsos mission. Also is Greek for Groves, so Groves like came up with this name. which is sent with the troops, like with the Normandy invasion, to check out like how far the Germans had gotten. So the military leader, this is Boris Pash. He's in the movie. We'll see that we'll encounter him later. This is actually not why he's in the movie. And the scientific leader is a Dutch physicist, Samuel Goudsmit, who had already been working in the US since the 20s. And Goudsmit actually wrote like a book about this about his mission. And just the frontispiece like shows you like how far the Germans missed, how badly the Germans missed the target. So here is you see this treehouse over here, and it has this very sarcastic caption like Germany's Oak Ridge. All right. So the Germans don't have a bomb. They're about to lose. Yet only one physicist left the project, namely Joseph Rotblat, a Polish physicist who had come to Los Alamos with Chadwick. And in March of 1944, Rotblat is already appalled when he hears Grove say at a dinner party, you realize, of course, that the main purpose of this project is to subdue the Russians. And so Rotblat is very much aware of the Russians attacking Germany from the east, right? And so he thinks of them as like our allies at this point. And so in December of 1944, with things becoming clearer, Germany has essentially lost, Rotblat leaves Los Alamos. And he has an interesting further life. Like in 1955, he signs the Russell-Einstein Manifesto shortly before Einstein's death, highlighting the dangers of nuclear weapons. And then in 1957, together with Bertrand Russell, he founded the Pugwash conferences, which got him part of the 1995 Nobel Peace Prize. All right, so he's the only one leaving, but others have their doubts. And so, for instance, like Robert Wilson, later the first director of Fermilab, here is what he looks like. So this is during the groundbreaking ceremony for Fermilab. This is what he looked like at Los Alamos. He organizes a meeting called The Impact of the Gadget on Civilization. So the gadget is how they refer to the bomb they were making. And this meeting was to discuss why are we continuing while the war is essentially over? So Oppenheimer attends this meeting and manages to convince Wilson and the other 20 or so participants that the war should not end without the world knowing about nuclear weapons. And so that carries the day. Right? All right. So by May of 1945, Germany is actually defeated. Right? Here's a famous picture of bombed out Dresden. Yet the project continues, and more people get cold feet. So in June of 1945, you get the so-called Frank Report by a group of Chicago physicists with Szilard again, which calls for a demonstration rather than combat use. Right? We're now talking about using the bomb to end the war in the Pacific. So Oppenheimer's reaction here is ambivalent. Right? So he shares some of the concerns of his colleagues, but he does not endorse the report. And in fact, in his own recommendation to the Secretary of War, he is actually getting behind the idea of no, we need combat use. All right. So Opper's attitude at this point is a little bit strange, right? So he, as best as I can tell, he's happy to leave decisions about the use of the bomb to military and political authorities. He's also happy to use his charisma to get his colleagues to go along with those decisions. And so he allows these reports coming out of colleagues with their doubts to essentially be buried, right? So this is true for the Frank Report, and shortly after the war, a similar report by the Association of Los Alamos Scientists with the beautiful acronym ALAS. And so the thinking behind this, I think, is that, Oppenheimer feels well, if we play along now, maybe they'll listen to us later. All right. So they charge ahead. Okay? Germany is defeated, but in July of 1945, there is the Trinity test in the Alamogordo Desert, right? So they don't need to test a uranium bomb. They're confident that that'll work, and they don't have enough uranium-235 to do the test, but they do need to test this plutonium bomb, right? And so so here it is. So here's the explosion, and here is like Oppenheimer and Groves like standing by the remains of the tower where they exploded this bomb. Success. So I want to play you a short clip about with Oppenheimer talking about the Trinity test later. Like this is in an NBC documentary in 1965.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
This, of course, has become like a very famous line. Now I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds. And I'm curious to see what they do with this in the movie. Right? Because remember, like Oppenheimer is saying this like 20 years after the fact. And so somebody who knew him well, Abraham Peiss, called this like one of Oppie's priestly exaggerations. And I can't resist like sharing like a comment quoted by Bernstein, some party guest, where Oppenheimer's also like at the party in the late 1930s, like blurted out like, never since the Greek tragedies has there been heard the unrelieved pomposity of a Robert Oppenheimer. Right? So I don't think that, I very much doubt he was thinking about the Bhagavad Gita. Frank Oppenheimer was there. He says, like, I think we just said it worked. That sounds more reasonable to me. And Robbie says, like, I'll never forget the way he stepped out of the car. His walk was like high noon, this kind of strut. He had done it. So there's one more famous comment. This is like Bainbridge to Oppenheimer. Now we're all sons of bitches. And Josh Peck gets to deliver that line, I assume. So Oppenheimer is conflicted, right? So the day after Trinity, Wilson hears him muttering, those poor people, those poor little people. But yet a week later, he is giving the general in charge of the bombing run over Hiroshima very precise instructions on how to do this. So in the meantime, we have like the historic meetings of the Allied leaders, moving back a little bit, like, to the beginning of 1945, with, like Germany about to be defeated. So Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at Yalta in February of 1945. And Stalin promised Roosevelt at that point that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan by August 15th. Then there's the next meeting in Potsdam in July, August 1945. You see that by now, like Roosevelt has died and is replaced by Harry Truman. Stalin repeats his promise about this, about entering the war. And so Truman is played by Gary Oldman in the movie. And like during the meeting, Churchill actually also like is replaced. Like he doesn't die, but he loses the election, and so he is replaced by Clement Attlee. And look at the date of this of the beginning of the conference. That is July 17th. That's the day after Trinity. That's clearly no coincidence, right? So this Trinity test was done on a very tight time schedule, and they clearly wanted to know whether this worked before this meeting. And so Truman told Stalin that they had this new weapon, which of course Stalin already knew through his spies in Los Alamos. So In August 1945, like these bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So like, you know, like I feel like sort of disrespectful to not, you know, spend more time on this, but you know, like this is the part of the story that I assume everybody knows very well. So here is the routes of the bombing runs from Tinian to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So on August 6th, like a uranium bomb, like a little boy, like is dropped on Hiroshima, over 100,000 people dead, 75,000 people wounded. Then a few days later, a plutonium bomb, Fat Man, is dropped on Nagasaki, and 65,000 people dead, 40,000 wounded. So how did the Los Alamos personnel react? So scientists, according to a later report, were very subdued. So apparently nobody celebrated. There were no parties. But the enlisted men, and this comes from a letter home from one of them at the time, like writes, like there were parties galore. We listened to the radio and danced and laughed, right? And you can sort of see, you know, sort of understand, like here are people like worry about themselves or their friends or their relatives, like being sent to Japan for like a ground invasion. And now they realize like this is not necessary. So that then is also like, you know, like a once popular answer as to why these bombs were dropped on Japan, right? They had resorted to kamikaze warfare. This was the only way to bring them to their knees. The alternative, an invasion of the mainlands, would have led to many casualties. And how would Truman have like explained to the American people that he had spent all this money on this bomb and then had not used it? Now, the problem with that story is that it seems pretty clear that after the bombs, the Japanese surrendered on the same condition that they would have been prepared to accept before the bomb, namely to keep their emperor. Okay. So the more plausible answer really is that the US wanted Japan to surrender to the US alone. Remember, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that they would declare war by August 15, and they did so on August 8, 2 days after Hiroshima. And so not long after the war, Patrick Blackett, remember, like the guy of the poisoned apple, wrote this book that became quite controversial, in which he advanced a thesis, which I don't think is unreasonable, saying that dropping the atomic bombs was not so much the last military act of the Second World War as the first major operation of the cold diplomatic war with Russia now in progress. Okay? And with that, we get to the post-war period, culminating in the security hearing of Oppenheimer in '54. So right after the war, there are some futile attempts by Oppenheimer to have some sort of international nuclear arms control. And so the US, the UK, and Canada, they call for some international organization through the United Nations to regulate atomic energy. And Truman actually asked his Undersecretary of State, Dean Acheson, to drop the plan together with like David Lilienthal. So Lilienthal was a great admirer of Oppenheimer. And this Acheson-Lilienthal report was actually like written for the most part by Oppenheimer. So that was good. But so when there's finally the first meeting of this Atomic Energy Commission of the United Nations, the plan is presented not by Lilienthal of Acheson, but by Bernard Baruch, who is much more hawkish and presents his own revised version of the plan, which the Soviets are bound to reject. Okay, because like the plan, like, you know, clearly seems to be out to just preserve the American nuclear monopoly. So this, like from Oppenheimer's point of view, is really a missed opportunity. And I add, like if ever there really was one, to get the Soviets to agree to international arms control, right? And so now, like, you know, the Cold War is really on. So Oppenheimer is sufficiently distraught by this idea that Baruch is going to present this Acheson-Lilienthal plan to have like an audience arranged for him with Truman. And so I assume this part will also be in the movie. So the conversation, as recalled by Truman, so Oppenheimer says, I feel we have blood in our hands. Truman says like, you know, never mind, we'll all come out in the wash. And then like after Oppenheimer leaves, he turns to Acheson and he says like, don't you bring that fellow around again. After all he did was to make the bomb. I'm the guy who fired it off. Now, this sounds like just a little too good for like Truman to have come up with like right on the spot. So probably the conversation was more something like this. So this is like more based on like recollections right after the fact, that okay, Oppenheimer says, I feel we have blood on our hands, and then Truman says like, I told him, so this is like what he later reports to Lilienthal, I told him the blood was on my hands to let me worry about that. And then like he very bluntly told Aitchison, he says, I don't want to see that SOB in this office again. Right? And later, like he starts referring to Oppie as this crybaby scientist. So as I said, like now the Cold War is on. Here's the Iron Curtain speech by Churchill with like Truman like smiling and looking on. And this is the map of Europe. And as somebody who grew up in the Netherlands in the 70s and 80s, I thought that the map of Europe would look like this, like in perpetuity. So international control of nuclear weapons is pretty much off the table. What about domestic control? Okay, there it looks a little better. So in October of 45, Truman urges Congress to establish an atomic energy committee to regulate the entire nuclear energy. And Oppenheimer actually helps draft Truman's message. And so the very next day, legislation is introduced to that effect, the May-Johnson bill by these two characters. And but that bill meets with fierce opposition among scientists. For their taste, the military retains too much influence, and there are long prison terms for even minor security violations. Oppenheimer, remember, his attitude of, just going along with the politicians, nonetheless tries to get his colleague to go along with this May-Johnson bill, but this time he fails. And surprisingly, the lobbying of the scientists actually defeats this May-Johnson bill. And like another bill by Senator Brian McMahon, is proposing like a fully civilian atomic energy committee, but still pretty draconian security provisions. So in August of 1946, Truman signs this into law. And so now, control of atomic energy is transferred from military to civilian authorities, and this Civilian Atomic Energy Commission is created. And this Oppenheimer admirer, Lilienthal, is appointed as the first chairman of the Atomic Energy Committee. And Oppenheimer is appointed to a 6-year term on like an advisory committee to this commission, and is elected its chair. So I note on as an aside that this Atomic Energy Commission continues to exist until 1974, when its functions are reassigned to other agencies, eventually to the newly created Department of Energy. So here's a picture of the Atomic Energy Commission, like in 1947. So you see Lilienthal, and there on the right you see like a guy who's going to play a big role in the movie, and a big role in Oppenheimer's life. Louis Strauss, that's how he pronounced his name, Strauss. And he was like a reserve admiral, so he liked to be addressed as Admiral Louis Strauss. And he's going to be played by none other than Robert Downey Jr. And Downey Jr. must have had like a very good day when he read the description in Burton Shurin of this character, right? Pathologically ambitious, tenacious, extraordinarily prickly, self-righteous to a fault. He remembered every slight and meticulously recorded them. Thin-skinned, vengeful, easily humiliated. This guy is going to be Oppenheimer's nemesis. Here is the General Advisory Committee in 1947. Fermi is also part of this. He's not in this picture. And I want to point out that this appointment required a security review. Hoover and the FBI had already been, collecting dirt on Oppenheimer, especially about his Communist Association. Yet Oppenheimer was cleared, right? But it was the same information that would be used against him in 1954. He also gets a new day job. He becomes the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, was like its most famous member, none other than Albert Einstein. And now it so happened that Strauss was actually also a member of the board of trustees of this institute and chaired the search committee to find a new director. So he's the one offering Oppenheimer the job, and he immediately gets annoyed with Oppenheimer because Oppenheimer, he feels, takes too much time to accept the offer. We're now moving into the late 40s, early 50s, the McCarthy era. So the period of the House of Un-American Activities Committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, UAC. And so in the spring of 49, Oppenheimer and 4 of his students, like all these left-leaning individuals, are served with subpoenas to testify before UAC. Joe Weinberg, Rossi Lomanowitz, David Bohm, Max Friedman. There's a picture of them, and Lomanitz is actually, will be in the movie. So on June 7th, 1949, it's Oppenheimer's turn to testify before a closed-door special session of the UAC with 6 congressmen, including Richard Nixon. So Oppenheimer is trying to please the committee, is basically throwing students under the bus, calling them commies, especially Bohm, Lomanitz, and Bernard Peters. And after just having charmed the committee, he gets out of answering questions about his brother. So he says, like, I will answer if asked, but I beg you not to ask these questions. And amazingly, like, the committee backs off. They do not ask him about his brother Frank. Now, he thought that, like all of this, is in closed chambers, but his testimony is leaked to the press. The students are furious. So are some of Oppenheimer's friends. Oppenheimer first denies that he gave any derogatory information, then makes a half-hearted attempt to set things right, but it does absolutely nothing to mitigate the dire consequences for those involved. And so one of them is like Joe Weinberg. He's put on trial for perjury because, like, illegal wiretaps showed that he lied about never having discussed a bomb project with a known communist. He had, in fact, discussed this with a guy named Steve Nelson. But he's acquitted in 1953 because that wiretap evidence could not be used, with the court, get this, disapproving of the verdict. Right? So the jury is told, we disapprove of your verdict. So even though he's acquitted, he's not reinstated by his employer, who had fired him 2 years earlier, the University of Minnesota. And he was not the only one. So a week after Robert, it's Frank Oppenheimer's turn to testify before the UAC. And 2 years earlier, a newspaper had reported that Frank, professor of physics at the University of Minnesota, had been a member of the Communist Party in the late 30s. So Frank categorically denied this, but he did not sue the paper, and that made, like, some U of M administrators very suspicious. And when questioned by the UAC, Frank and Jackie, both in the movie, this story is probably going to play an important role, admit that they became members in the late 30s, but left in the early 40s. Okay. Now, right before he goes to DC to testify, Frank Oppenheimer offers his resignation to the U, thinking that the U will not accept this. But of course, the U is very happy to wash its hands of this customer. So this resignation is in fact immediately accepted. And so Frank and Jackie then sell one of their Van Goghs to buy some land in Colorado and become cattle rangers. So, like, they sell the painting for 40,000. So this is indeed not the most spectacular Van Gogh, but I'm sure this is now worth, like, quite a bit more than $40,000. He makes a kind of a comeback, like 2 decades later, where he becomes the founder of the Exploratorium in San Francisco, the country's first hands-on science museum. All right. So in all of this, now in August 29, 1949, the news breaks that the news breaks a few days later when they pick up the signals of this, but the Soviet test their first atomic bomb. And Joe 1, as it's called, turns out to be an exact copy of Fat Man, courtesy of Klaus Fuchs, right, who early the following year is finally confessing to having been a spy. It's interesting that like the security apparatus never smoked him out. So this leads to, like, a lot of hysteria in the US, right? So this exchange is a good example. So Teller, what do we do now? And Oppenheimer just tells him, like, keep your shirt on. So Lawrence and Teller, the hawks, now argue that the Soviets will try to build an H-bomb and that the US had better beat them to it. But both the General Advisory Committee, led by Oppenheimer, and the Atomic Energy Commission, led by Lilienthal, they oppose this crash program for an H-bomb, right? And they recommend that Truman does not do this, arguing that there's no military relevance. A-bombs are just as effective as H-bombs for retaliation. And all it will do is just fuel this arms race. But Truman listens to Teller rather than Oppenheimer and announces his decision to develop the H-bomb. And so the way Oppenheimer sees it, this is the last opportunity at arms control that is being missed. And this really turns into a turning point in the nuclear arms race. Like from this point onwards, like, you know, it really, you see like much higher production of nuclear weapons. And this is also like, you know, where the positions of Lilienthal and Oppenheimer become untenable. So in February of 1950, under pressure from Truman, Lillian leaves the Atomic Energy Commission, and a more agreeable person, Gordon Dean, takes his place as chair, and Oppenheimer would not be reappointed to the General Advisory Committee when his term expired in 1952. But he still remained a consultant and thus still needed his security clearance, which, remember, was granted to him in 1947. So I want to read you like a passage from Burton Sherwin, like that nicely summarizes like, you know, where we stand at this point, right? So basically, like for nearly 5 years, Oppenheimer had tried to use his prestige as a scientist to influence the national security establishment from the inside. His old friends on the left had warned him that this was a futile gamble. He had failed in 1946 when the Aegis and Lilienthal plan was sabotage. And now, once again, he had failed, right? To persuade essentially Truman and his administration that they should not go for the H-bomb. The administration now supported a program to build a bomb 1,000 times more lethal as the one that destroyed Hiroshima. Still, Oppenheimer would not upset the apple cart. He would remain an insider, albeit one who was increasingly outspoken and increasingly suspect. All right. So now, like we're after the race is on for the H-bomb. And in 1950, it was not at all clear whether this was even possible. So all of Teller's ideas up to that point for his super bomb had failed dramatically, and things only changed the following year through the intervention of the Polish-born mathematician Stan Ulam. And even Oppenheimer, despite his opposition to the H-bomb, called the resulting Teller-Ulam mechanism technically sweet. So here is the first H-bomb. This is November 1952. Evaporating an island in the Enewetak Atoll, 450 times more powerful than the bomb on Nagasaki. The Russian followed in short order, not quite as big, but still. Interestingly, like, you know, when Fuchs was arrested in 1950, Oppenheimer joked that he hoped Fuchs had told the Soviets all about the super, as that would set them back several years. Remember, because at that point they did not have a clue how to build like an H-bomb. All right, so 53, Eisenhower, the first Republican president in 20 years, and Eisenhower is going to appoint Louis Strauss to become the new chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, right? Remember, like, he is being played by our friend Robert Downey Jr. And so this is like, you know, the nemesis of Oppenheimer, who at that point already has a rich history with Strauss. And so the most famous incident is during a Senate hearing about sharing radioisotopes with Norway. So Strauss opposes this because he thinks that may have sort of military applications. And so Oppenheimer in his testimony just like pokes fun at Strauss. So he says, well, you can use a shovel for atomic energy, a bottle of beer. These isotopes are less important for military application than electronic devices, but more important than vitamins. Uh-oh. So he then turns to, when he's done, he turns to the general counsel of the Atomic Energy Commission, also in the movie, Joe Volpe, and he says, how did I do? And Volpe like just says, too well, Robert, much too well, right? Because like he made now like an arch enemy out of this guy, Louis Strauss. So Strauss wants to really put a stop to Oppenheimer advising the government. He's a thorn in his side, right? So both out of personal animosity and because of like his meanwhile very public opposition to the H-bomb and the secrecy in which this is shrouded, right? I mean, Oppenheimer goes around now saying like, what we need is candor, so that the American people like have the facts before them on the basis of which like these decisions are made. But Strauss actually prefers to use his own power as the director of the Atomic Energy Commission to oust Oppenheimer, rather than, you know, throw Oppenheimer to Joe McCarthy. And he gets like a former aide of Senator McMahon, like serving on the Congressional Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, William Borden, to do his dirty work. So Borden, like McMahon is a Democrat, so now it's under Republican control. So he lost this job, but he's still like somehow obsessed with Oppenheimer. And so Borden is also in the movie. And Strauss, like, you know, very much against the rules, gives Borden access to Oppenheimer's security file. And on the basis of this, like, Borden writes an incriminating letter to the FBI, concluding that more probable than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union. And this letter makes it up the chain of command, right? Goes to the FBI, goes to the president. And so this is enough for Eisenhower to order a blank wall placed between Oppenheimer and classified information, right? And so, like, here's this cartoon, like, you know, like who is being walled off from what. But the letter is also too flimsy to put Oppenheimer on trial. But Strauss has just a solution, like, you know, we don't need a trial, we just hold a security hearing of this Atomic Energy Committee. And this then happens. And so here are sort of what Bernstein calls the ingredients of the richest brew for Oppenheimer. So there, you know, was his capacity of making enemies. There was his left wandering in the 30s, which, like, in the 50s now looked very, very bad. So remember, like, his girlfriend Jean Tadlock, his wife, his brother, and his friend Hakon Chevalier, about whom much more in a little bit. And, you know, in 43, Oppenheimer had been joking that he had probably belonged to every communist front organization on the West Coast, like many intellectuals at in that period. Now, the main offense, of course, was his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, where he clashed with Teller, Lawrence, and other hawks. And, you know, all of this, of course, is taking place in the political climate of the 50s, like McCarthyism. So here is Oppenheimer and his lawyer, Lloyd Garrison, who would be in over his head. He's in the movie. And the deck was really stacked against Oppenheimer. So the lawyer for the Atomic Energy Committee was far more skilled than Oppenheimer's. And, you know, he has a security clearance, and Lord Garrison does not. Moreover, the Atomic Energy Commission, like, uses wiretaps and eavesdrops on conversation of Oppenheimer and his lawyers. And they do not share documents that they confront Oppenheimer with. So Oppenheimer does not see these documents, nor do his lawyers. And Garrison is just, like, very timid in protesting these, this behavior. And you see, like, you know, in a normal trial, this would never have been accepted. But these were, like, these, Atomic Energy Commission security hearings. They could make the rules up as they went, and Garrison just went along with it. And so, as Burton Sherwin bluntly summarized the situation, they said, like, it wasn't a veritable kangaroo court. So now one question is, like, why did Oppenheimer subject himself to this ordeal, right? I mean, like, his security clearance was about to expire. Why did he not, like, accept, like, one of the offers to go teach, like, in Paris or wherever? So here Einstein's reaction to when he was told about these impending hearings is interesting. So he says, like, all Oppenheimer needs to do is go to Washington, tell the officials they're fools, and go home. And this bit may be apocryphal, but hopefully not, because it's very insightful. He says the trouble with Oppenheimer is that he loves a woman who doesn't love him, the United States government. And Oppenheimer himself, when asked by a friend why he did not go abroad, he said, like, damn it, I happen to love this country. Okay? Now that's a sentiment that is completely foreign to Einstein, right? So Einstein is actually on record during World War I, where he says, like, well, I consider affiliation with a state to be a business matter, somewhat akin to one's relationship to life insurance, right? Completely different to Oppenheimer's sentiment, damn it, I love this, I happen to love this country. Okay? So the hearings proceed. And the central piece turns out to be what is known as the Chevalier incident. And when I came to this country, like, in the very early 90s, I quickly realized that among physicists, like, you need to be up on your quantum field theory, but you also better know, like, the ins and outs of this Chevalier incident. So what was it? The Chevalier was a professor of French literature at Berkeley. He became friends with Oppenheimer in 1937. And so, he is in the movie. What is the incident? It was late 42, early 43. It's unclear exactly when this happened. But Chevalier was approached by a guy named George Eltonton, also in the movie, to sound out Oppenheimer about passing on information to the Soviets. So Chevalier declines, but feels he needs to tell Oppenheimer about this. So he tells Oppenheimer at a cocktail party at Oppenheimer's house. And Oppenheimer later recalls saying something to the effect like, oh, well, that would be treason. And that was the end of the conversation. Now, the problem is that Oppenheimer waited several months before he reported this incident to security personnel. And when he finally did, he fed the officers a cock and bull story. So he is interviewed by Boris Pash, right? This is why Boris Pash is in the movie. And so Oppenheimer gives him Eltonton's name, tells him others were involved, but refuses to give names, right? So he, presumably he wanted to protect his friend Haakon Chevalier. Now, in September 43, another interview, now this time by Lansdale, and under a direct order from Groves, Oppenheimer gives Chevalier's name, but he does not retract his fabrication that others were involved. Now, Lansdale, to his credit, he points out during these hearings that, as far as he's concerned, it's a manifestation of hysteria. That's what he tells Rob, to treat associating with communists in 1940 the same way as treating associated with communists in 1954, right? But that's a distinction that others do not make. So, all right, so he's interviewed by Pash, by Lansdale. The FBI after the war is also going to look into this. And of course, they also now check out Chevalier and Eltonton, who are wondering, like, who gave them their names? And so Oppenheimer himself is questioned. And now he says, no, it was just Eltonton and Chevalier, and there were no others involved. Remember, in 47, when he starts working for the Atomic Energy Commission, like he needs to be, there has to be a security check, and he is cleared by the FBI. Yet 7 years later, this incident comes back to haunt him. And this is the most famous part of the security hearings, which were published in full in like this big fat book, like In the Matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer, reprinted by MIT Press in the 70s. So this gives you like a taste of like how this interrogation by Rob went. Did you tell Pash the truth about this thing? No. What did you tell Pash that wasn't true? That Eltonton had attempted to approach members of the project, 3 members of the project, through intermediaries. So that we may be clear, did you discuss with or disclose to Pash the identity of Chevalier? No. Of course, Rob knows all this because he has the documents in front of him. Let us then refer for the time being to Chevalier as X. Did you tell Pash that X had approached 3 people on the project? So Oppenheimer, like, I'm not clear whether I said there were 3 X's or that X approached 3 people. Well, didn't you say that X had approached 3 people? Again, like, Rob has the documents in front of him. So Oppenheimer says, probably. Why did you do that, doctor? And then Oppenheimer says, because I was an idiot. And so the story is that Rob told his wife that night, I've just seen a man destroy himself on the witness stand. And Rob actually showed this exchange about Chevalier to Teller right before Teller testifies. Remember, this is the guy who's going to play Teller. And Teller's testimony is among the most damning for Oppenheimer. But Teller has to be a little bit careful. He wants to get rid of Oppenheimer, but he has to worry that, about his standing in the physics community, so he doesn't want his paw prints all over this. So he says, like, he doesn't doubt Oppenheimer's loyalty to the US, but he has often disagreed with him and doesn't explicitly mention, but clearly it's what it's about, like the H-bomb. And so then, like, thinking about like this strange, like, changing his story about the Chevalier, he says, I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands which I understand better and therefore trust more. All right. So we get to the verdict in quotation marks, because remember, this is a hearing, not a trial. So here's the Personal Security Board of the Atomic Energy Commission, like, convened for this purpose. Gordon Gray, Thomas Morgan and Ward Evans. Two of them are in the movie. And the board's recommendation is 2-1 to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance, but they also state that they believe Oppenheimer to be a loyal citizen, right? So the offensive things are, the lying about like the Chevalier incident, the feeling that he hasn't been like completely truthful like during the hearings, and like his opposition to the H-bomb. So now, in fact, the dissenter, Evans, he seemed to be the most paranoid about commies during the hearings. Like he actually wrote like a minority report in which he called this decision like a black mark on the escutcheon of our country. And we also have to keep in mind that this recommendation is not the final word. It still has to be voted on by the Atomic Energy Committee commissioners. And Strauss was very worried that they would overturn it. So he gets Kenneth Nichols, the general manager of the commission, also in the movie, to add a letter that puts his own and Strauss's spin on this Gray Board's report. So guided by Strauss, Nichols wrote that the record showed, this is not something that the Gray Board says, the record showed that Oppenheimer is a communist in every respect, except that he did not carry a party card. And he also is careful to dismiss the Gray Board's mentioning of Oppenheimer's opposition to the H-bomb, right? That's really the only new charge brought forward in 1954 to preempt criticism that Oppenheimer is really being punished for giving the government advice based on his honest assessment of the situations he's asked to assess. And in the end, with this, like highly prejudicial document, the commissioners vote still, 4-1 that Oppenheimer was loyal. Strauss is the only dissenter, and 4-1 that he was but 4-1 that he was a security risk. Now with Harry Smyth dissenting, and Harry Smyth is famous for the Smyth report, released just days after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, sharing what information like Truman was willing to share with the American public. Now after the hearing, the communist hysteria appears to be abating somewhat, but of course remember Sputnik in 1957. So here's a nice comment by Einstein shortly before he dies. In 55, he writes to his son, he says, God's own country becomes stranger and stranger, but somehow they manage to return to normalcy. Everything, even lunacy, is mass-produced here, but everything goes out of fashion very quickly. Okay, I want to end with like contrasting sort of the impression that I've been giving of the Oppenheimer affair so far, which is like very much how the American physicists think about this, with how Russian physicists like in the US like think about this, right? So the American physicists, like, and I think that's probably the sort of view promoted in the movie. There's outrage over the US government's treatment of Oppenheimer. There's agreement with Oppenheimer about his opposition to the H-bomb, and the bad guy in the story is Teller, the bête noire of US physics, right? People like after this meeting, like people like Rabi refuse to shake hands with Teller. But Russians in this country, I found, like think very differently about this, right? So first of all, they don't feel they feel there's no need to feel sorry for Oppenheimer. Look, I mean, if you fall out of favor in the Soviet Union, you'd be sent to the Gulag. Instead, this guy is disgraced, but he continues to be Einstein's boss in Princeton. And they agree with Teller that it was important to get this H-bomb, and that history proved the Hawks right and the Doves wrong, right? And one way to make the argument is that, well, like the Soviet Union in the end collapsed because their economy could not keep up with the US economy, like in building all these bombs, right? So I think this is just sort of an interesting contrast. I won't comment on this further. I just want to, give a brief epilogue. Because like Oppenheimer does, like in the 60s, like with Kennedy now, like president, it gets rehabilitated. So Kennedy like wants to give him like this a Fermi Award of the Atomic Energy Commission, like much to the chagrin of Strauss. Kennedy like is assassinated before he can actually give Oppenheimer the award. So the award is actually handed to Oppenheimer by Lyndon Johnson. And the most interesting picture taken on the occasion is this picture of Oppenheimer now shaking hands with Teller, right? And you see like he can muster like a wry smile, but look at Kitty Oppenheimer, right? If looks could kill, like Teller would be reduced to like a small heap of ashes. So this is the background image that you've been looking at. This is not any old hat. This is Oppenheimer's pork pie hat, right? And this picture was actually put on the very first issue of Physics Today, which is like the journal that all members of the American Physical Society find in their mailbox like every month. And so just as a indication of how famous Oppenheimer had become at that point, like everybody would recognize, okay, this pork pie hat, that's Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer like died not long after, like he got this form of rehabilitation at the age of 63 of throat cancer. He's a lifelong smoker. So here's like a picture like later in life. And I want to conclude by showing you the slide with like a list of books that I recommend you read if you're interested in the various aspects of this like very fascinating story.